Hi there, Lisa Rana here, and welcome to another Assemble This video. Today's card is all about creating this watercolor look without having to use a paintbrush. And it's such an easy technique to do, and it's just a really loose way to have fun with color. I am starting out with using the flowers from the Hello Fresh Start Sentiment Kit from Unity Stamp Company. I just love the size of these flowers. It's just really big. It creates a nice focal point for the card. I have my stamp and some watercolor paper in my Misty, and I just prepped that paper with an embossing buddy because I will be embossing this image, and then I just inked it up with some Versamark ink. I did stamp that a couple times just to make sure I had good ink coverage. And then I'm using some gold embossing powder. And I'm just going to sprinkle that on and make sure that I get a nice coverage of powder and then use my heat tool to melt that down. It's already looking very pretty. I love that shine from the embossing powder. Next, we're going to be using some distress inks for our watercoloring. And I'm just going to smush those down onto my surface. I'm using a media mat, but you could use any type of a slick surface to put this ink down. Add a bit of water, and then I'm using an acrylic sheet to pick that ink up and then just smush it down onto the paper. And it creates this lovely watercolor look. And it doesn't take any technique. You're not even trying to keep it in the lines, though I am trying to keep the color of the red over the flowers. What's really neat is the raised edge from the embossing creates little wells for that ink to kind of pool in and create different shades of color. Just on its own, it's not even something that I have to make happen. So I dried that layer just because I want to add a little bit more dimension and to kind of mimic that pooling of the ink. So I dried that layer and then I'm just taking spots and adding it over my flowers here and there. And I'm just using a corner of my acrylic sheet to pick that ink up and then kind of place it in the area that I want. And that just again creates another layer and dimension of that color because I'm layering it on top of the one that's dried previously. And then I'm just going to dry that one more time and then move on to our green color. This is bundled sage, and I'm just going to add some water and then kind of focus on the area where the leaves are. So trying to stick closer to the flower and adding the green. I didn't want to add too much because when you mix red and green, you get brown, and that was starting to happen. So I started to kind of back off a bit and just pick up and add little dots where I wanted it after I did that initial smushing. And finally, I wanted to add in a bit of coolness and a gray. So I'm using iced spruce, and that I'm just going to go around the edge and just kind of fill in the background. Just kind of smush that down. And you can change the variance of that spreading of the ink by how much you press down the acrylic paper. The more you press and move that water around underneath the acrylic, the more it'll spread. And if you just pick it up and kind of tap it, then it'll kind of stay in the area that you're tapping. So it's kind of fun. It's almost like watercolor paintbrush style, but just with this big acrylic sheet. I just really love the effect in the end. And I did make sure that that was fully dry. So I dried it with my heat tool and then set it aside just to give it some more time. Next, I covered my card base in this pretty gray color, and then I just stamped a background stamp on top that's called a faithful letter. And then I'm moving on to my sentiment. This happy anniversary is from the I did, I do, and I will stamp set, and it comes with this matching die. I just stamped my sentiment on some scrap paper in my Misty, and then I'm using the negative of the die and just lining that up around my stamped image. That way I know that the border around my stamp sentiment is going to be perfect on that die cut. And then I just place that back into the negative area of that die cut. I'm prepping the surface again with the embossing buddy because I'm going to be embossing later. And then I'll just stamp that a couple times using some Versamark embossing ink. Just want to make sure I get a nice solid impression of that ink. And then cover that with the same gold embossing powder that we used for the flower earlier, just so it matches. Perfect. And then the magic happens when we melt it with our heat tool. And now I'm ready to assemble everything. I just die cut down a piece of vellum, and I'm just going to glue that down to the center of my card, just like that. And then I'm going to pop up my watercolor panel, or the ink smooshed roses that look like watercolor. And I'm just going to pop that up with some foam adhesive, just right in the center again. And then to add a little bit more dimension, I did put some foam adhesive behind the sentiment. And I'm just going to tack that down towards the bottom third of the card. And then to add just a little bit more movement, I'm going to use some gold Nouveau drops and add some drops around the sentiment, and then a few more up top around the flowers. I just like the way that this creates a little bit more dimension and movement in the card. And here is the finished anniversary card. I just think it's really pretty with all that gold shiny embossing, and then the super effect of ink smushing. It's a great way to get some watercolor without actually pulling out a paintbrush and trying to achieve that look on my own. As always, I'll have all the supplies linked in the description of this video. Please give it a thumbs up if you liked it. Plus, if you have any questions or sweet comment, post below. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed, and I'll see you again soon for another video. Bye!